Thank you, Deb, for that introduction. And welcome to all of you tuning in today for this very timely conversation. During the last several years, we've experienced a surge of hate-filled conspiracy theories, disinformation, and extremism, both online and off. Once fringe ideologies have become mainstreamed and normalized, adding to the hyperpolarization of our society and raising risks, including of violence, to vulnerable individuals and communities, and indeed to democracy itself. The digital channels spreading hate virally today at the speed of a click are unprecedented and have been instrumental in weaponizing hate and disinformation generated by state and non-state actors alike. Yet at the same time, digital spaces have enabled us to connect, to innovate, and to educate like never before. How we keep the good and effectively combat the bad is one of the most challenging problems of our time. And each of these panelists, Ms. Dumpson, a target turned advocate, Senator Lujan in Congress, and Mr. Wu in the Biden administration, represent vital players in what has to be a whole of government, whole of society mobilization. In the wake of the January 6th insurrection last year, ADL launched the Repair Plan, providing our roadmap to fight online hate. The ADL Repair Plan focuses on the need for comprehensive reform, platform accountability, and better protections for targets of harassment. Digital platforms are virtually unregulated in this country, and we have no independent, verifiable ability to look into what those platforms are doing and what they're not doing. We know from ADL surveys and research that platforms by and large are doing a spectacularly bad job at locating and removing hate and extremism online, even in the wake of revelations from whistleblowers and others. While Europe is moving forward in some promising ways, Congress appears to be gridlocked, letting promising legislation like that introduced by Senator Lujan languish. At ADL, one way we've reacted is also to work on the state level seeking change. We have a social media transparency initiative in California and are well on our way to passing multiple new laws covering doxing, cyberswatting, and cyber harassment in a growing number of states. So it's clear there's much to do, which is why I'm thrilled to be in conversation with our terrific panelists today. Let me turn first to Ms. Dumpson. 5 years ago today, you were the target of an anti-Black hate crime, harassed on campus and then repeatedly harassed and doxxed by white supremacists online. Sadly, this type of online harassment is an all too common occurrence. In 2021, ADL found that 27% of Americans experience severe online harassment. What more must happen to adequately protect targets of online harassment and provide them with the resources they need?
Well, thank you for that question. First, folks need to know what local resources and protections are available to them on campus, within the community, and on social media platforms. Second, folks need law enforcement officers and medical professionals to be culturally competent in their questioning, and so that survivors are not re traumatized when telling their stories. Third, folks need to know that there are allies within their communities that are willing to resist and fight back against these kinds of attacks, as the intent of hate crimes is to strike fear not just for the individual, but for entire communities. And fourth, leaders in tech and social media companies need to be more transparent about the policies and procedures for reporting hate speech and other hateful content on their platforms.
Are there specific things you've mentioned that people have to be allies? Are there specific things that you can tell the audience that they can do to better support targets of the kind of harassment you went through?
Absolutely. It's simple things like just leaning into discomfort, reading about the communities that are different than you, because everybody has a difference and diversity is important and diversity is valuable. But unfortunately, we see this kind of bigotry and hatred happen. And I feel that it comes from a place of not understanding communities, not understanding difference, and not being able to cross culturally communicate. I feel like if we are able to get to the root causes of our differences and to be able to have productive conversations, even when we don't agree with people, that doesn't undermine that person's lived experiences and humanity, I feel like we'll be in a much better position.
Thank you, Ms. Thompson, and also for the personal courage you showed in taking on and litigating against white supremacists. Senator Lujan, last fall you introduced the Protecting Americans Against Dangerous Algorithms Act in the Senate to amend Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act in order to hold platforms accountable for using algorithms that promote content that leads to on the ground violence. Why is regulatory reform like this so important?
Well, thank you for the question. And as all of you know, today more of our lives are online than ever before. However, with that transition came an even greater reliance on online platforms to stay connected to our friends and colleagues, to access critical information and news, and just to live our everyday lives. Many of these services deeply rely on algorithms to decide what content they show their users. Often, these algorithms are optimized to promote content that will provoke a response. This is usually done for one simple reason: to maximize growth and revenue. When these algorithms promote dangerous and unlawful content because it maximizes profits, companies who design the algorithms should be held responsible. It's that simple. Companies should not be allowed to maximize profits over the safety of their users without repercussions. It is dangerous that social media companies are incentivized to promote extremist and divisive content that endangers the lives and well being of Americans. This content is sowing division, peddling deadly conspiracies and hoaxes, and inciting violence. That's why the Protection for Americans from Dangerous Algorithms Act specifically targets platforms' role in amplifying the dangerous and unlawful content that promotes terrorism or robs people of their civil rights. Platforms have a responsibility to make sure their algorithms are not punishing, or I should say, not pushing extremist content out to millions and millions of users. This bill would enshrine that responsibility into law. Now, I agree with you that Congress must do more to hold social media companies accountable. Our democracy and national security are at stake. It's that big.
Thank you so much, Senator. And ADL, as I've mentioned, supports your bill, which is an entry point that's so important. It gets at some of the most egregious, unlawful, violent, and harmful conduct. I did want to come back to you, though, sir, because so many are concerned that congressional gridlock will prevent meaningful reform like your bill from passing. How else can Congress decrease online hate and increase platform accountability?
Well, I'm certainly hopeful that the urgency will bring more members together because we must hold social media companies accountable when they are negligent and amplifying dangerous content. But congressional oversight should not be limited to just Section 230, which is where there's been a lot more attention. We need greater transparency into how online platforms make decisions that control what millions of Americans can see every day. We should empower and protect whistleblowers like Frances Haugen when she came forward to share their stories. And I'm hopeful that that will also lead to action. So, having more individuals, more leaders come forward and willing to stand up when they see companies that they may have worked for abusing the system. And in the case of what we saw with Facebook, now Meta, we saw the endangerment and the targeting of young children. That has galvanized the support of Democratic and Republican members, and I'm certainly hopeful will push all of us to act soon. But I also introduced something called the TLDR Act, so these platforms can no longer trick users into signing away their rights and confusing terms of service agreements, that I joined with Senator Cassidy. And what I mean by that is every one of us, that when we sign up for these programs and everyone is guilty, you just scroll right down and you hit the button that says, I agree with everything, and you sign everything away. What this legislation would require is that there would be something in plain English that everyone can understand, that's a summary before you hit click. And that way, I'm hoping it'll protect more rights. But it's another one of those pieces of legislation where I have a Republican partner, and it's just showing how bipartisan commitment and agreement is in place. And I'm certainly hopeful that the Commerce Committee and the Senate will move quickly. And we've already heard positive things from leadership if we can only get it to them on the floor. So I'm still optimistic, Eileen.
That is good to hear, Senator. Mr. Wu, during the State of the Union, President Biden referenced the harms children faced online, stating, and I quote, "We must hold social media platforms accountable for the national experiment they're conducting on our children for profit." What are the White House's next steps to hold social media companies accountable for the hate, harassment, and extremism they amplify and profit from? And how can communities and organizations like ours support your work?
Thank you so much for that question, and I'm glad you picked up on that in the State of the Union speech. the president, when he even first decided to run for office, I think it was motivated in part by the rise of divisive hate speech in our country and the way in which the online environments and frankly other environments have come to divide us, not unite us. He was very struck by the Charlottesville situation, and since then, since becoming president, he has been, you know, I think just from the top has been focused on the question of what can we do more to hold tech accountability and do more about division in our country more generally. Moving forward in present times, I think we've been encouraged and we've been watching hard and encouraging Congress to make progress on a series of areas. One of them, as we said, is child privacy, and we've been very explicit and open about what we see as the problem in this area. First of all, there's billions of us already on social media, and children are no exception. Children are subject to the platform's intensive, excessive data collection vacuum, which they are using to deliver harmful and sensational content, and along with paid advertising. And also, the president has been, since he was a candidate, strongly in favor of reform of Section 230. So these are some of the areas we're pursuing. We also are, pursuing a range of administrative and regulatory efforts. We've asked the FTC, just to name one, and we expect this as soon as we have a confirmed fifth member of the FTC, to write a rule on privacy and surveillance.
One of the big challenges, and I'd love to hear how the White House is going to address this when we talk about combating hate online, is that much of the online hate we see, while vile and undeniably harmful, is not unlawful and is protected under the First Amendment, what many in the field call the lawful awful hate. How do you go about, what kind of incentives, how can you use the law and other levers you have to go about that?
Well, listen, thanks. It's a great challenge. We are bound by oath to uphold the Constitution. We believe absolutely in the First Amendment and the right to speech, and we would never do anything or support a law that is in violation of the Constitution. But there is such a thing as content neutrality. There is such a thing as trying to adjust the volume of speech. There is such a thing as zoning, and we think we're well within. For example, just talk about reform of Section 230. There's a number of proposals out there that would create greater accountability for illegal conduct. That is very different than violating the First Amendment. All kinds of illegal conduct, which frankly there is no remedy for today, or limited remedy, that is immunized. And so that when it comes to either illegal content or content neutral measures to kind of have some control, we think there's a lot of room and a lot more to be done than is being done right now.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wu. What I'd like to ask now to each of the panelists, and we'll go in the same order, if you'll spend 1 minute before we conclude, what haven't we mentioned that you think is very important to raise in the context of combating online hate, harassment, and extremism?
So I just want to take a second to center the experiences of survivors and state unequivocally that fighting back against this kind of hatred and bigotry doesn't have a cookie cutter model, as each survivor and community faces their own unique struggles in coming forward after facing an attack. Oftentimes people ask me, what do you do if you're targeted? And I like to think of what I call the 4 R's. Record and document the incident. 2, report the incident to law enforcement or community organizations if you feel safe in doing so. 3, resist by increasing protections and being vigilant in your community. And 4, being resilient and digging deep, being prepared for the lifelong impacts that hate has on you. It's been 5 years since the hate crimes that I experienced, and I still live with PTSD, depression, and anxiety. In 2019, I had the opportunity to sit face-to-face with one of the neo-Nazis who cyber-harassed me online, and I received the in-person apology that he gave, but only after he had committed himself to doing 200 hours of community service with racial justice organizations, mental health counseling, additional educational coursework related to racism and sexism, and he had to renounce bigotry. I speak from experience when I say that no one is sheltered from hate once it's acted upon.
Senator Lujan, something you'd like to raise as we conclude our panel?
Well, 2 areas. One would be misinformation of information. And while we're bringing much attention to stopping the spread of misinformation in English, what's concerned me is how non-English language misinformation is proliferating. Just recently, I led an effort with my colleagues to Mark Zuckerberg, urging Meta, formerly Facebook, to work to actively stop the spread of Spanish language disinformation by Russian state-sponsored outlets. Now, to give you an example, RT Television in Espanol has over 18 million followers, and they are actively misleading about the invasion of Ukraine. Second, we need legislation that ensures the safety and privacy of children. I appreciate what Mr. Wu said. Parents should not have to worry about their kids being exposed to harassment, bullying, or hate speech every time they go on the internet. And these protections are common sense, and there's bipartisan support behind the legislation to keep kids safe online. But it's good to see everyone talking about it now. We have to join together and bring forces together to stop this from happening.
Thank you so much, Senator. And Mr. Wu, why don't you take us home for today?
Sure, thank you so much. But the second thing I want to point out, sometimes we forget that hate and disinformation is often a business model. And I don't always know if we've done enough. You know, there's some people just say stuff, but there's a business model underneath it, you know, selling something, trying to lure people into something else. And I think often it's one of the most constructive ways we can make progress is trying to get at essentially the business of hate and try to undermine what you could call the hate and disinformation industrial complex. So I think that's something to focus on.
Well, thank you. The business of hate, indeed. Thank you so much to our incredible panelists for their hard work in the fight against online hate and for taking the time to share their expertise with our leaders today.